pasar aquí.
Thank you, Manuela. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start this evening by thanking the Museo del Prado, and in particular, Miguel Zugaza, Miguel Falomir, and Manuela Mena, for the very kind invitation to speak tonight, to celebrate the rare display in Madrid of Goya's portrait of the Duke of Osuna, on view here in Spain for the first time since 1896. I would also like to acknowledge two of my colleagues, Susan Grace Galassi, the senior curator at the Frick Collection, who has researched this particular Goya portrait for many years and has been very generous in sharing her expertise with me, and Monica Luengo, with whom I visited in the summer of 2 years ago, the Alameda de Osuna. I would also like to apologize for delivering this lecture in English, but I thought I would spare you my terrible Spanish with a partly Italian, partly English accent. It is an extraordinary occurrence that at the moment, two great masterpieces from the Frick collection, the Duke of Osuna by Goya and Ingres, portrait of the Comtesse d'Aussonville, have both left New York and are on view here at the Prado. You will forgive me, therefore, if I start this lecture tonight slightly off topic with the second extraordinary portrait. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres' portrait of Louise Albertine de Broglie, the Comtesse d'Aussonville, was painted in Paris between 1842 and 1845, and is among the painter's best known and loved masterpieces from his late career. Neither Ingres nor the Comtesse d'Aussonville would have imagined in the 1840s that less than 100 years later, in the 1930s, the same portrait would have been described as the most famous Ingres now in America. After almost a century as the highlight of the Aussonville collection, in Paris first and later in Switzerland, this astonishing portrait of the 27-year-old granddaughter of Madame d'Estel left Europe and entered the collection of a museum that was recently created in New York City. After being acquired in the first few months of that year, the canvas arrived on the 23rd of April, 1927, at the Frick Collection, and has since then been one of the highlights of the collection. I suspect that both the French painter and Madame la Comtesse would have found this transatlantic move of the portrait quite surprising. But surely they would have been even more surprised, and no doubt, I hope, pleased, to find that the painting would have become an international celebrity. On the 27th of December 1937, the portrait became the cover image of Life magazine in America, one of the first old master paintings to be used as a cover image of that magazine. And today, without going so far geographically and in time, the Comtesse d'Aussonville is the poster girl of the current Marvelous Ingres exhibition here at the Museo del Prado. I think both Ingres and the Comtesse would have been very pleased with this, and the young Louise Albertine de Broglie would have also been delighted with one of her most recent admirers and with her encounters here with the Queen of Spain. To understand why the Ingres and the portrait by Goya, that is the focus of this lecture, were acquired by the Frick Collection, and why today they can both be in Madrid, we need to briefly consider the history of the New York Museum and how it was created over the last century. Henry Clay Frick was an American coke and steel industrialist, a millionaire and a collector, originally from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, who starting in the early 1900s put together an extraordinary collection known for its outstanding quality, which focuses on mainly European art, painting, sculpture, and decorative arts from the 15th to the 19th century. Frick was particularly interested in portraits and landscapes, and in general, he chose to acquire paintings of outstanding quality that he enjoyed living with, The idea was very much that he had a house and the works he acquired were works that he would live with on a daily basis. He moved permanently to New York in 1905, and between 1913 and 1915, very quickly, he built a large residence in New York on Fifth Avenue between 70th and 71st Street, which was designed by the English architect Thomas Hastings, and in which he lived for the last 4 years of his life. In 1919, Frick died and left the house and the collection as a public museum, on the model of many museums, house museums, he knew from Europe, such as the Wallace Collection in London, the Museo Paul di Pezzoli in Milan, the Musée Jacques Marandré in Paris, or the Museo Lázaro Galdiano here in Madrid. To this day, the Frick collection has been maintained, preserving the spirit of the house and the character it had when Frick lived there. Unlike larger encyclopedic museums, such as the British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum or even the Louvre, the Frick does not display its works following a chronological or a geographical display and a division. It is in fact common in the rooms of the Frick to encounter a Spanish 17th century masterpiece, such as, for example, Murillo's self-portrait, surrounded by 2 canvases by the Dutch painter Johannes Vermeer, and over a piece of furniture designed by Jean-Henri Riesener in the 18th century in France for Queen Marie Antoinette, over which is a 17th century Florentine terracotta sculpture by Massimiliano Soldani Benzi. This is indeed one of the great aesthetic pleasures when visiting the Frick. When Henry Clay Frick died, he left the museum in his will, I quote, "for the purpose of establishing and maintaining a gallery of art, and of encouraging and developing the study of fine arts and of advancing the general knowledge of kindred subjects," end quote. He also stipulated in his will that all the works of art he had acquired and left as part of the museum can never leave the building of the museum itself. Therefore, any work of art purchased by Frick between the late 19th century and before 1919 and left to the museum can never be displayed outside the house on Fifth Avenue. Masterpieces such as Giovanni Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert, which you see here in the center, or the 2 amazing portraits by Titian of an unknown man and of Pietro Aretino, or the 2 portraits of Sir Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell by Hans Holbein, and the St. Jerome by Il Greco over the mantelpiece, cannot be lent for exhibitions, and really can only be seen in New York at the Frick collection. This type of stipulation is something that the Frick has in common with other non-lending institutions, such as the Musée Condé in Chantilly, the Wallace Collection in London, or the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. At the time of Frick's death, his widow still lived in the house, and it was not until after her death that the museum opened to the public on the 16th of December 1935, almost 20 years after Frick's death. During this period of time, the trustees of the museum, headed by Frick's son, Charles Frick, and under the guidance of Helen Clay Frick, Frick's daughter, and a key figure in the history of the museum until her death in 1984, decided that the collection would not be frozen to what had been acquired by their father before 1919, but that they would continue to add substantial works to the collection. The purchase of the Ingres portrait of the Comtesse d'Orsonville was the most important of these additions in the collection between 1919 and the opening of the museum in 1935. You have to imagine a whole period in which the collection acquired significant works without making this public between the death of Frick and the opening of the museum. And the Ingres was the key work amongst them. When the portrait was purchased by the Frick in 1927, it was announced that the present purchase is the first to be announced since Mr. Frick's death, although it is understood that other additions have been made, it is evident that the estate, in increasing a collection already magnificent, is maintaining the same high standards. Several other important works were bought for the museum in these years. Among them, just to give you an idea, were Filippo Lippi's diptych of the Annunciation, an astonishing Renaissance work, which was acquired in 1924, Chardin's Lady with a Bird Organ, which was bought in 1926, and Gentile Bellini's portrait of Doge Giovanni Mocenigo, which was bought in 1927, the same year as the Ingres. It was said at the time that, I quote, "The Frick collection should buy only great paintings, following the founder, of great individual merit, and not attempt, like a big museum's, to have specimens of styles and epochs." End quote. This is indeed the case for the museum to this day, and we continue to acquire works of art and add to the collection, very much only focusing on excellence. One of the most significant group of objects purchased by the Frick collection after it opened was a group of 6 masterpieces that had belonged to the American millionaire John Pierpont Morgan, usually known in America as J.P. Morgan. In 1911, Morgan had appeared in a famous and wonderful cartoon representing him as the Magnet. Morgan is seen in New York using a large magnet in the shape of a $sign to attract all the great artworks from Europe to America. Indeed, Morgan's collection was one of the largest and most important assembled in the world over the last 200 years. When Morgan died in 1913, the collection was divided and many of his pieces were left to various American museums, including the Metropolitan Museum and the Morgan Library. Frick himself acquired many pieces from the Morgan collection before his own death, 6 years later, including a large number of Italian bronze sculptures. Effectively, most of the Italian bronzes come from the Morgan collection to the Frick, the Limoges enamels, French Renaissance enamels from the Valois court, and a large group of decorative arts. But especially the extraordinary canvases by Fragonard showing the progress of love, which decorated originally a room conceived for Madame du Barry, the mistress of King Louis XV of France, and later used in Morgan's own house in London. And they arrived at the Frick in 1914, 1915. By the early 1940s, however, the Morgan estate still had a number of outstanding works in their collection, and these belonged to Morgan's children and heirs. In December 1943, so almost 10 years after the museum had opened, the trustees of the Frick collection purchased 6 works from the Morgan heirs for a total sum at the time of $495,000. The key piece in this group of objects, and the most expensive by far, it was valued $250,000, so almost half of the full value of the 6 objects, was the monumental bronze angel by Jean Barbet, an extraordinary survival of 15th century metal sculpture from France, and as most monumental metalworks in France were destroyed during the Revolution. There's really nothing like this that survives in or outside of France. And for a long time, it was believed that it was probably too good to be true and that it may be a 19th century fake. In fact, recent analysis has proved that this is absolutely right and an absolutely extraordinary object. It's a very large bronze sculpture. The second most valuable object of the group that was acquired from Morgan was Rembrandt's early portrait on panel of Nicholas Rutz, which was valued $85,000. And this went to join 2 other works by Rembrandt in the collection, a self-portrait and the Polish Rider. So we currently have 3 Rembrandts in the museum. 3 more paintings that joined the Frick collection with the Morgan purchase were Sir Joshua Reynolds's portrait of the English general John Burgoyne, the man who basically lost the American colonies to England in the 1770s and had paved the way for American independence, so very much an American hero in a way rather than an English one. John Constable's great landscape with the white horse, and Jean-Baptiste Greuze's Woolwinder. After the Barbet Angel and the Rembrandt portrait, the most important artwork acquired in this group in 1943, however, was Goya's portrait of the Duke of Osuna, bought for $50,000. The painting was described at the time as, I quote from a newspaper, an early portrait by Goya representing the Duke of Osuna. This canvas, too, is of great historical interest, but more important is that it reveals, at their best, Goya's early incisive manner and penetrating insight. Simple, dexterous, and bold, it is in color, subtle, and delicate. Its pedigree is impeccable, end quote. All works acquired by the Frick collection after 1919 are allowed to travel. And this is the reason why both the Ingres and the Goya can be exhibited here at the Prado today. And we lend them regularly to exhibitions within reason, while other paintings, for example, all of El Greco's and Velázquez, can never leave the museum. Frick himself was a great admirer of Spanish art. He traveled to Spain twice, in 1893 and in 1909. This is a photograph of the Prado taken by his daughter, Helen Clay, during their second trip in 1909. And we have a beautiful diary of Helen Clay's visit with her father to Madrid, in which she lists all the paintings she saw at the Prado and which ones were her favorites. Curiously enough, the top painter, as far as she was concerned, was Murillo, and she goes on to describe the John the Baptist, the young John the Baptist by Murillo, as even better than Las Meninas. When Sir Gerald Kelly painted a posthumous portrait of Frick in 1925, which was based on photographs, he showed the collector against the background of the east wall of the paintings gallery at the Frick collection, which displayed 3 masterpieces of Spanish art by Goya, Velázquez, and El Greco. So this is a photograph of the wall as it had then appeared, the Goya, the Velázquez, and the El Greco, and here is part of that wall. Incidentally, this fireplace doesn't exist anymore. There is now a door here, which leads to a new gallery. Both the Goya and the Greco are still there. The Velázquez now hangs on the side wall, but this wall has slightly changed since Mr. Frick's day. The first Spanish painting acquired by Frick in 1904 was Murillo's self-portrait. By 1919, Frick owned 8 Spanish paintings, and apart from the Murillo, he had 3 masterpieces by El Greco, the very early portrait of Vincenzo Anastagi, which was painted in Rome in the 1570s, the St. Jerome, which was acquired from the Cathedral of Valladolid in 1905, and the Purification of the Temple, which was sold to Frick by Aureliano de Beruete in Madrid in 1909. Frick's favorite work in the entire collection was said to be the outstanding portrait of King Philip IV at the Battle of Fraga by Velázquez, which he bought in 1911 from the collection of Prince Elias of Bourbon-Parma. Frick also had acquired 3 canvases by Goya, or attributed to Goya, all 3 in 1914. The Forge, which had been in King Louis Philippe's Galerie Espagnole at the Louvre, the portrait of an officer known as the Conde de Tepa, which had been in the Lázaro Galdiano collection in Madrid, and the late female portrait, usually known as Doña María Martínez de Puga, which had also belonged to Aureliano de Beruete and then to Sir Hugh Lane in London. The Duke of Osuna, therefore, became in 1943 the 4th Goya to join the collection, the 9th Spanish painting at the Frick, and the last purchase that the museum has made in terms of Spanish art. The Osunas were one of the greatest Spanish aristocratic families who commissioned paintings by Goya in the 1780s, at a time when the Aragonese painter was making a name for himself in Madrid. Goya in these years was principally involved with the design of tapestry cartoons for King Charles III and for the Princess of Asturias at both El Escorial and El Pardo. But through a number of patrons and aristocratic families, he began his career as a portrait painter to the Spanish aristocracy. Two of the most important patrons for Goya in these years were the king's minister, the Count of Floridablanca, which you see here on the left in a full-length portrait, now at the Banco de España, and Charles III's younger brother, the Infante Don Luis, here he is, who, now at this time in exile, had established his own smaller court at Arenas de San Pedro, which Goya visited in the summers of 1783 and 1784. Goya in these years produced the grand full-length portrait of Floridablanca and a series of portraits of the family of Don Luis, which culminated in this magnificent family portrait now at the Fondazione Magnani Rocca outside Parma in Italy. In the second half of the 1780s, Goya also became close to the family of the Counts of Altamira, for whom he produced 4 family portraits. The portrait of the Count, on the left, was destined for the newly created Banco de San Carlos, now the Banco de España, of which Altamira was one of the founding directors, while those of his wife and his 2 children, Vicente and Manuel, were housed in the large palace that Ventura Rodriguez was building for the family on the Calle de la Flor Alta. Madrid in these years was not a very large city. Here you see it in Goya's wonderful sketch for the Feast of San Isidro, and you can recognize the river down here. Here's the Palacio Real, San Francisco el Grande, and it's just a whole view of Madrid, in many ways not different from what it looks like today. It had about, at the time, 150,000 inhabitants. And it was said at the time that all aristocratic families were in some way related to one another, and they called each other cousins. Goya's success in these years is witnessed by his famous letter to his friend Martín Zapater of the 1st of August 1786. Me había ya establecido un modo de vida envidiable. Ya no hacía antesala ninguna, el que quería algo mío me buscaba. Yo me hacía desear, y si no era personaje muy elevado o con empeño de algún amigo, no trabajaba nada para nadie. Y por lo mismo que yo me hacía tan preciso, no me dejaban ni aún me dejan, que no so cómo de cumplir. A year earlier, on the 16th of July 1785, the Dukes of Osuna had issued a payment a favor de Don Francisco Goya Pintor de 4,800 reales de vellón por los 2 retratos que ha hecho de su excelencias. These 2 were the portraits of the young couple, now in different private collections here in Madrid. The Osunas were a formidable couple by 1785. Don Pedro de Alcántara, María Cayetano, Ciriaco, Rafael, Lorenzo, Domingo Vicente, Téllez-Girón, y Pacheco, was born in the Osuna Palace in Madrid, on the Calle de Leganitos, on the 8th of August 1755, the son of the 8th Duke of Osuna. After his father's death, he inherited the titles, and amongst the many of them, that of 9th Duke of Osuna, 10th Marquess de Peñafiel, 13th Conde de Ureña. He had followed a military career and was Lieutenant General of the armies, and was shown in the portrait in his uniform of Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Guards. By July 1785, Osuna was 30 years old, and he had not yet inherited his father's titles. 14 years earlier, on the 29th of December 1771, Pedro de Alcántara Téllez-Girón had married his cousin, María Josefa de la Soledad Alonso Pimentel y Téllez-Girón. He was 16 years old, she was slightly older and 19. María Josefa had titles of her own, and she was, in her own right, the Countess Duchess of Benavente. The union between the two saw the coming together of 2 of the most illustrious Spanish families, both of which had, in the 17th century, celebrated viceroys of Naples, noted in part for their artistic patronage. Pedro Téllez-Girón, the 3rd Duke of Osuna, had been viceroy of Sicily and Naples between 1611 and 1620, where he was a patron of Ribera. Juan Alonso Pimentel de Herrera, 5th Duke of Benavente, instead, had been viceroy in Naples during the previous decade. The Countess Duchess was described by Lady Holland, the English ambassador's wife in Madrid at the time, as the most distinguished woman in Madrid by virtue of her talents, worthiness, and taste. Except from the Queen, she was, together with the Duchess of Alba, the most renowned aristocratic woman in Spain at the end of the 18th century. Both Osunas were involved with the Sociedad Económica de Amigos del País. The Duchess was in the Junta de Damas, and were well known for their progressive and enlightened views. They were both patrons of the arts and letters. The Duke was made in 1793 a member of the Royal Spanish Academy, and the couple had an impressive library of 25,000 volumes. These included not only Spanish literature, but also foreign books, especially from England and France. The Osuna library contained books by Rousseau, Diderot, and Voltaire, and the Duchess had spent time in France as a young girl. Their intellectual circles included prominent literary figures of the time, such as Leandro Fernández de Moratín and Ramón de la Cruz. The Duchess was herself a great patron and friend of artists, musicians, actors, and bullfighters. Her fashion choices remained French throughout her life. Goya's portrait of 1785 shows the Countess Duchess of Benavente very much as a French aristocrat, in the fashion launched by Queen Marie Antoinette and exemplified here by this portrait of the Queen of France by Vigée-Lebrun of 1783, just a couple of years earlier. Maria Josefa was known for her elegance, often more, one can say, than her own beauty. In 1783, the couple acquired a property 6 miles north of Madrid, not far away from today's airport, which was known as La Alameda de Osuna, and which was named by them El Capricho. Throughout their lives, the Osunas worked on the decoration of the main building there and of all the surrounding smaller constructions in the garden. This is an impressive complex, still to this day, loosely based on French models, such as the Trianon at Versailles. The Osunas hosted tertulias here, and they had a private theatre for plays and music. Luigi Boccherini, who had worked for the Infante Don Luis, composed music for the Osunas in 1786, and music by Haydn and Rossini was also played at both La Alameda and in Madrid. An area at the entrance of the garden was also dedicated to bullfights. The gardens at La Alameda were improved with a series of small buildings and pavilions. There was a casino de baile for music and dancing, and here you see the interior and the exterior. There were small classical buildings, such as the Templete de Bacco, or the small construction that was decorated with a marble sculpture of Venus, carved in 1793 by Juan Adan, and where live doves and birds were kept. So you have to imagine this sculpture in the central rotunda here, and here you see the pigeonholes for birds that were nested in there. Among the more unusual buildings at La Alameda was the Casa de la Vieja, with trompe-l'œil frescoes in its interior, showing objects that were imagined as being in a humble dwelling. There was an ermita, also decorated with frescoes inside, and which also housed a real-life hermit, who lived there full-time. Most unusual of all was a room entirely decorated in moss, where people could keep cool in the summer. In July 1787, the 8th Duke of Osuna died, and his son inherited the title. The new Dukes of Osuna commissioned a large and astonishing family portrait by Goya, probably to celebrate their new titles, and the painting was paid 12,000 reales in October 1788. The Duke himself appeared dressed in mourning for his father, but the portrait heralded a new era in the family history. It is difficult for us today to understand how innovative and extraordinary a painting like this would have appeared in the 1780s. No longer the stiff representations of Ancien Régime aristocrats, this is one of the first paintings that portrays a modern family. The Altamiras around the same time had commissioned from Goya and from the painter Agustin Esteve a series of individual portraits of family members following a well-established tradition. Here are the Count and the Countess, two of their children represented by Esteve. This is Francisco Javier and Juan Maria, and Vicente and Manuel by Goya. Each family member appears individually in separate canvases in a tradition that really looks back to Italian models of the 16th century. The Osunas, instead, are shown all together, father, mother, and 4 children, almost as a modern family photograph. This is no doubt the result of the ducal's family interest in enlightened thoughts and the readings of Rousseau and Voltaire. The Duchess of Alba herself, at the same time, had been brought up by her grandparents following Rousseau's model of children's freedom and close contact with nature. When the Osunas commissioned this portrait from Goya, they wanted to appear as a modern, French-style parents. 4 of the other children had died previously, and by 1788, the couple had only 4 living children. The eldest boy and heir to the title was Francisco de Borja, the future 10th Duke, there he is, who is shown standing next to his mother and riding his father's cane as a hobby horse. His younger brother, Pedro de Alcántara, was only a year old and portrayed sitting on a cushion, holding in his hand a charming toy carriage. Their 2 sisters were older. Josefa Manuela was born in 1783 and was the eldest surviving child, and she stands holding her father's hand, while the 1 year younger Joaquina is under her mother's protective arm, over here. The group is accompanied by 2 family dogs. A 3rd daughter, Manuela, was born a few years later in 1794. This is the ultimate enlightened family, one in which husband and wife are equals, and in fact, the Duke and Countess Duchess had equally impressive titles independently of each other, and where boys and girls are apparently similarly integrated in the family. For a father to be holding the hand of a daughter rather than a son is a pretty extraordinary occurrence in 18th century portraiture. Goya remained particularly active as a portraitist for the family throughout his life. It has been estimated that the painter produced more than 30 works in total for the Osunas. Apart from the Spanish royal family, no patron had ever commissioned as many works from Goya. For the family, he painted, in 1798, 2 full-length portraits. One of General José Ramón Urrutia y de las Casas, on the left, now in the Prado, who was a close friend of the Duke's and a military colleague. The other of Manuel La Peña Rodríguez y Ruiz de Sotillo, who was also a military commander, but particularly close to the Duchess and served as her gallant escort on the right, and that is now in the Hispanic Society in America, New York. While Urrutia wields in the portrait all of his military authority, Manuel La Peña was known for his particularly hopeless military skills. At the time, he has apparently been nicknamed Doña Manuela for this reason. And it is worth considering that this nickname may also reveal other interests of La Peña, which would have made his friendship with the Duchess altogether much more acceptable, probably, to the Duke. Goya also continued to portray many members of the Osuna family later in life. After Francisco de Borja became the 10th Duke, Goya painted him in 1816 in an astonishing canvas now in the Musée Bonnat in Bayonne. And one of the great pleasures is to see them growing up in Goya's eyes and by Goya's hand. In the same year, his younger sister, Manuela, by now Duchess of Abrantes, was also portrayed by Goya in a half-length painting, and unfortunately she was never represented as a girl because she was not in the family group. Out of the portraits of the 2nd generation of Osuna family members, the most beautiful is clearly the one of Joaquina, now Marquesa de Santa Cruz, painted by Goya in 1805, and there she is as a young girl and as a grown-up Marquesa. The enlightened spirit of her parents, had by this date developed into full neoclassicism, and the Marquesa is shown in a full Napoleonic fashion, almost as a modern reclining goddess. The official patronage of the Osuna family resulted in a number of commissions that were not only portraits. For the family, Goya painted 2 large lateral canvases in the chapel dedicated to San Francisco Borja, the 4th Duke of Gandia, and an ancestor of the Countess Duchess in the Cathedral of Valencia. The main altar of the chapel, showing the conversion of the saint, had been painted by Marino Salvador Maella. Here it is, in the center. In October 1788, Goya was paid 30,000 reales for his canvases in the chapel. These were 2 on the side walls and showed events from the life of that saint. The canvas on the left represents San Francisco Borja leaving home, while the opposite one, instead, showed the saint at the deathbed of an impenitent. According to a contemporary life of Francisco Borja, the saint was present at the deathbed of an impenitent man, while the man refused to receive the last Christian sacraments. Borja held a crucifix in his hand, and the man was stubborn in his rejection, and the image of the crucified Christ, I quote, feeling exasperated, detached its nailed right arm, and placing its hand in that profusely bleeding, lacerated wound on its chest, withdrew a fist filled with a lot of blood, and hurled it with indignation at the frowning, denigrating face, saying, "Since you scorn this blood which was shed for your glory, let it serve for your eternal unhappiness." Then that pitiful man, with an awful blasphemous shout directed against Jesus Christ, gave up his soul, convulsed by a horrid moan, and it was turned over to the infamous ministers of fire and fright, end quote. Goya's representation of the scene in his Valencia altarpiece is faithful to the account, and the ministers of fire and fright appear to take away the soul of the impenitent man behind his bed. And it's this extraordinary group of figures here behind the man. But the most interesting paintings that the Duke and Duchess commissioned from Goya were a small series of canvases that he produced in the 1780s and 1790s. Between 1786 and 1787, he painted 7 small paintings of Asuntos de Campo for El Capriccio at l'Alameda. These were all genre scenes of strange subjects, some of which, still to this day, are often difficult to fully understand. Among them were playful subjects, such as the scene of a girl on a swing, accompanied by a male and female friends. Another canvas was described by Goya as otro cuadro que representa un mayo, como en la plaza es un lugar con unos muchachos que van subiendo por él a ganar un premio de pollos y roscas, que está pendiente en la punta de él, y varias gentes que están mirando. Others show accidents, such as a group of people moving a large stone, with a man who has been wounded while working, or another with a woman who falls from her donkey. So there is the large stone being moved and the wounded man, and here's the accident with the woman who fell. It is unclear if these were real-life scenes that had been witnessed by Goya, or if they were imaginary episodes. There is a village procession, which in Goya's bill is described as una procesión de una aldea cuyas figuras principales o de primer término son el curá, alcaldes, regidores, gaitiero, etc., y demás acompañamiento con su país correspondiente. And the most surprising in the series is the one showing highwaymen attacking a coach. Again, the bill of the 12th of May 1787, provided by Goya for the 7 scenes, describes the small picture as unos ladrones que han asaltado a un coche y después de haberse apoderado y muerto a los claseros y a un oficial de guerra que se hicieron fuertes están en ademán de atar a una mujer y a un hombre. Many of these paintings are similar in subject to some of the canvases Goya was painting in these years for the Real Fábrica de Tapices of Santa Barbara, and it is therefore no surprise to find that the Osunas had bought from the painter some of the small sketches that were initially made before the tapestry cartoons, such as, for example, those showing the 4 seasons, and I'm here showing you summer and winter. These would have worked very well with the Dukes and Duchesses' other small paintings, such as the 7 Asuntos de Campo. Also for the Alameda, Goya painted 10 years later, in 1797, 6 cabinet paintings showing scenes of witchcraft. The Osunas paid Goya 6,000 reales for 6 cuadros de composición de asuntos de brujas que están en la Alameda. There they were displayed together in the Duchess's boudoir in El Capriccio. They focused on depictions of witches' activities, from the Sabbath to monstrous happenings. Here are 2 of them, and 2 more. As it has been noticed before, some of these subjects derived from early 18th century plays by Antonio de Zamora, such as The Forcefully Bewitched, El Hechizado por Fuerza. Depictions of such scenes, showing people's superstitions and beliefs, must have been particularly interesting to an enlightened audience, who of course denied the existence of witches and magic and considered such beliefs ridiculous. In 1795, the Duke of Osuna was granted the Order of the Golden Fleece. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1798, the Duke was appointed ambassador to Vienna. By this point, the French Revolution has drastically altered European society and politics. The Osunas left in January 1799 and reached Paris. They remained there for a year while waiting instructions to continue to Vienna. They were in the French capital in time to witness the stellar ascent of General Bonaparte, who became at that point the first consul. A year after leaving Madrid, and with the changes in the political situation, they were already back in Madrid, without ever reaching Vienna. The Duke died 7 years later, aged 52, on the 7th of January, 1807. His wife survived both him and their son, dying in 1834. One of the biggest questions about the Frick portrait is when it was painted and what it was painted for. While payments survive for other Osuna portraits and for the small paintings, both the genre scenes, the Asuntos de Campo, and the witchcraft ones, as we have seen, and for the Valencia Cathedral canvases, no payment has ever been discovered in relation to the Frick portrait. In the early 20th century, it was believed that the portrait was the one referred to in the 1785 payment, and that it formed a pair with the one of the Countess Duchess of Benevente in her French costume. Already Berruete and other art historians suggested at the time that this could not have been the case. In fact, we now know that the correct pair of canvases is this, and that these were the ones that were paid for in 1785. The Frick portrait was therefore dated to the later 1780s. But when we examine the 3 images of the Duke by Goya, the first of 1785, the second in the family group from 1788, it is clear that the Frick's portrait must post-date both of them. The Duke looks visibly older. It is also clear that the portrait of the Duke from 1785 and 1788 are remarkably similar, if not identical. Goya must have based both portraits, the features of them, on the same drawing or sketch. If you look at the head, it's basically exactly the same. And this is common in other cases with Goya. The head of the Duke is basically identical. The Frick's portrait, instead, shows the Duke as an older man in a less frontal pose in 3/4. The Duke is shown holding a letter which includes the inscription Il Duque de Osuna por Goya. The face is beautifully and sensitively painted, and particularly striking is the use of exceptionally expensive lapis lazuli blue to paint both the Duke's coat and the background behind him. Unusually, as I already mentioned, there is no payment for this portrait in the otherwise very complete set of documents that witness the relationship between Goya and the Osunas. And with the use of lapis lazuli, this must have been a very expensive commission indeed. It appeared, indeed, as the property of the Osuna family in 1896. 2 main questions about the portrait have therefore never been fully answered. The first is about the date. Even though it was originally believed to have been painted in the 1780s, it cannot have been created as early as that. More typically, the painting has been dated to 1795-98, around the time when Goya painted the witchcraft scenes for the Osunas. The fashion of the Duke's clothes is typical of the second half of the 1790s. This would put the picture before the beginning of 1799, when the Osunas left for Vienna. By 1795, the Duke had received the Golden Fleece, and so it has been argued that the portrait must predate 1795, as the order does not appear in the portrait. The painting, however, shows the Duke in a very private mode. No order of any kind is on his coat, and he clearly had others beyond the Golden Fleece. and there are basically no signs of his official titles apart from the open letter with his name on it. This is very much a private commission for a private portrait. Comparing the Frick's canvas to other portraits from the second half of the 1790s, such as, for example, the one of the minister, Gaspar Melchior de Jovellanos, a date around then is plausible, especially because of the fashion of the two, what they're wearing, but more recently has been suggested on stylistic grounds that it could have been painted much later and be a posthumous portrait, painted after the Duke's death in 1807, and that its style is comparable to later paintings by Goya, and the outfit could be explained by deriving from an earlier portrait, maybe a miniature. However, there is no conclusive evidence to prove when exactly the painting was created by Goya. By being displayed here at the Museo del Prado, I very much hope that this will be a chance to be able to compare this work with a number of other paintings by Goya from different periods of his career to try and get a clearer idea of when it was painted. The second question is if this portrait, like the earlier 1785 one, had a pendant of the Countess Duchess. We know that Goya was paid on the 12th of January 1787 for 3 portraits of the Osuna children, now lost, and that in 1792 he also made a drawn portrait on paper of the Countess Duchess wearing a striped dress and the sash of Queen Maria Louisa's Royal Order for Noble Women. By all means, not all of the works painted by Goya for the Osunas survive, and these still remain to be found or identified. It is unclear, however, if there ever was a portrait of the Duke's wife to accompany the Frick canvas. The three-quarter pose suggests that maybe there was an equivalent portrait, female one, to go with it as a pendant. But if this was the case, there is no trace of such portrait, not even in the later documentation of the Osuna collection and sales. Over the last 3 months at the National Gallery in London, the exhibition Goya the Portraits saw the reunion for the first time since the end of the 19th century of the canvas of the Osuna family portrait, the earlier one of the Countess Duchess, and the Frick one of the Duke. This was an extraordinary family gathering. The last time these 3 pictures were shown together was at the Osuna family sale in 1896. Notwithstanding the enlightened background, the subsequent generations of the family directed it towards total bankruptcy. By the time of the 12th Duke's death, a large sale was organized. On the 9th of May, 1896, an article appeared in the newspaper The Athenaeum. I quote, "Some years ago, after a series of loans and financial transactions, the vast patrimony of the Duke of Osuna, once the richest nobleman in Spain, passed into the hands of creditors. The family united in a single representative more than 40 titles of Duke, Marquis, Count, and Baron, which had accumulated by different alliances with families such as the Mendoza, the Benavente, and Borja, the ancestors of Pope Alexander VI, Lucrezia Borgia, and the Duke of Gandia, who became afterwards St. Francis Borja, General of the Order of the Jesuits. The family of Osuna reached their highest prosperity in the 17th century during the lifetime of Don Pedro Girón, Viceroy of Naples, celebrated for his lavish extravagance and splendor, and they possessed vast landed property in Italy, Flanders, and Spain, and lived with great magnificence until 1845. The creditors have brought out a number of pamphlets giving full details of their heavy losses, and it appears that in 40 years, from 1845 to 1885, the Duke ran through the enormous sum of 12 million sterling, which he received in cash after mortgaging all his property. The Osuna collection consists of 330 paintings in oil, 48 watercolors, etc. The specimens of Goya are numerous. They include a great variety of subjects and styles. Several portraits of members of the Osuna family are of unequal merit and interest." End quote. So the advert in the newspaper announced the bankruptcy and at the same time the sale. This was the sale at which the family portraits and many other works by Goya were dispersed. At the time, most of the Osuna paintings were photographed. It seems that both portraits of the Countess, Duchess, and the Duke were probably still unlined, virtually untouched, judging from how the surface appears in the images. And these early photographs also allow us to see them still in what seem to be probably their original frames, or at least the frames in which they were displayed when belonging to the Osuna family. And it is curious to notice that they both have matching frames. So did all of the portraits always have matching frames, or were these made independent at some later stage? Both the two portraits, don't have these frames any longer, unfortunately, even though the present frame on the Frick painting is not far stylistically from its previous one. It's a similar style, but it was definitely put on later, probably by Morgan. Incidentally, the family portrait here at the Prado still has the Osuna frame, in which it was photographed at the Alameda in 1896. The portrait of the Duke was bought by a Parisian collector, Danin, who sold it to the dealer Agnews in England, in London, only a few years later in 1901. On the 18th of July 1902, J.P. Morgan acquired the painting, which remained in his family for the next 40 years between London and New York, until the purchase by the Frick collection in 1943. A recent chapter in the history of the portrait has been its restoration in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Paintings Conservation Department, which took place in 2014. The restorer, Dorothy Mahon, worked on the canvas, removing layers of yellowed varnish, which brought the painting back to its original, vibrant blue coloring. If you remember it before, it was much greener in color because of the varnish. Many of the tones that had become greener because of the varnish are now brilliantly blue, as Goya originally intended them. This is all created using the very expensive pigment ultramarine, which was made from ground lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. It shows that the portrait was, as I mentioned, an incredibly expensive and prestigious commission, and an important painting in the Osuna family collection, even though we still don't know when exactly it was painted and why. On behalf of the director and the trustees of the Frick collection, it is a great honor today to be able to share this masterpiece by Goya with you, and I very much hope that the period that this painting will spend here in Madrid will help us understand more about Goya, and in particular about this specific extraordinary portrait, which we're very proud to house in New York. Thank you.